When DID forms, are we looking at parts breaking off from an already established personality, or are we looking at pieces of a personality that failed to integrate? Hey there, and welcome back to our channel. On this channel, we talk about mental health with a special focus on how it affects us as a DID system. And in our last video, we took a deep dive into the theory of structural dissociation, which is kind of the mainstream theory when you are looking at how DID is developed. And I thought it would be interesting to do a video that compares the theory of structural dissociation with an older model, which was core theory. So just a quick review of the theory of structural dissociation. Basically, what the theory says is that everybody is born with parts. Nobody is born as just like one cohesive person. Everybody's born with parts. And sometime between the ages of 6 to 9, those parts coalesce into one main personality. With DID, what happens is trauma prevents that integration. So a child who hasn't experienced significant trauma is going to be able to integrate those different parts of their personality to create a cohesive identity. But for a child that is experiencing severe trauma or repeated trauma, that trauma can make it so those parts can't integrate because the part needs to stay separate and hold on to the trauma separately so that the child can continue to go on through life as if they weren't affected by the trauma. Now, a big thing in the theory of structural dissociation is that there are parts, and there's the emotional parts and the apparently normal parts. The emotional parts are the parts that hold trauma, and the apparently normal parts are the parts that go about and do the day-to-day activities. So that's just a brief summary of how the theory of structural dissociation is applied to DID. In core theory, the idea is that you are born as one cohesive identity. And so there is a core personality who is basically the original child. And the parts that form in DID break off from this core personality. And the parts exist to protect that core. The core tends to be the part that is unaware of the others and identifies most with the body. Although some cores can be frozen in time, they usually age with the body. And even those cores that are frozen in time are still unlikely to remember the trauma, or if they do remember it, they're going to be emotionally disconnected from it. When you are looking at core theory, that's really where this idea of integration or final fusion really comes into play, because if you are coming from the standpoint that the original way that the brain was functioning was as one personality, and then trauma happened to create these parts that broke off from the core, then it makes sense that you would think the way to fix that is to bring all those personalities back into one person. So when you're looking at core theory, the treatment model is going to be final fusion. I can't go into core theory as deeply as I did with theory of structural dissociation because I couldn't find a defining book for core theory or articles. It was really difficult to research this theory because it is considered an older, outdated theory. And so most of the research that talks about core theory is older, and a lot of it, quite frankly, is behind a paywall that I just don't have access to. And so the articles that may have had the information that I needed to really do a deep dive are articles that I just can't access. So the information that I have is based off of those few articles that I was able to find. Now, when it comes to core theory, Pierre Janet is basically considered the father of core theory. The general consensus is that he developed it. Now, I can say that in the research that I did, I could not find, and I did find some original Janet writings, and in those writings, I couldn't find anything that specifically talked about DID as the original being like the core, and it didn't talk about how DID originates, like the formation of it. He is credited, rightfully so, with assuming that DID is caused by trauma. He's really where we get the trauma-based model from. And so he is kind of the father of DID research when it comes to that. But again, even though I could definitely find things where he said trauma causes these parts, I couldn't find any specific language that talked about the parts breaking off from an original person. I think it's implied, but I couldn't find any direct quotations about that. Like I said, I could not find a defining article or book that really can be seen as the introduction of core theory. And the thing with the theory of structural dissociation is we have a defining piece of literature for that. The Hidden Self is the book that basically introduces that model. I couldn't find anything equivalent when it comes to core theory. And based on what I was able to find, I think it just was the general assumption. I don't know that there was any one piece of literature that really definitively defined that. I think it just was generally how it was assumed DID formed. So when it comes down to it, the differences between the theories is essentially this. When DID forms, are we looking at parts breaking off from an already established personality, or are we looking at pieces of a personality that failed to integrate? And that's kind of where the push and pull between the theories comes from, is basically how are alters formed. I did find some interesting information as I was researching this. A lot of the research took me to internal family systems. For the sake of this video, I'm going to just do a brief overview of internal family systems, or IFS. If you want us to do a more in-depth video about it, let us know, and we'll do some more research and pull that together. Now, when it comes to IFS, the general assumption is that everyone has parts. So it is a little different from theory of structural dissociation in that they don't necessarily talk about being born with parts that then integrate. It's everybody has these different parts of their personality. And what's distinct though is that even though everybody has these parts, everyone does have a core self that has a wise and compassionate view of the person's life. But then you have these parts that kind of do the everyday functioning. So you have managers that do daily functioning, firefighters that distract from pain, and this could be in the cases of past trauma. And then you have exiles, who are the trauma holders. When it comes to the idea of the core self is capable of taking care of the system, and that's what IFS calls this collection of parts that exist in a person, is a system. And so the core is capable of taking care of that, but is often overridden by the managers and the firefighters, who are trying to stay protected from the trauma that the exiles are holding. A big part of IFS is that they don't pathologize the parts. And they essentially, there's even a book that's called No Bad Parts. They don't see any parts as being bad or evil. It's basically that all parts are benevolent, but are potentially misguided in their behaviors. The treatment model with IFS is to heal the exiles and allow managers and firefighters to take on more beneficial roles that allow the system to work together, with the core self ultimately taking control. In therapy, you're really looking at engaging the core self, who then explores the parts and helps figure out how to do the healing and bring everybody together. Now, IFS is not DID, which can be there's a lot of confusion when people are first learning about IFSs. It just sounds like DID. It's not. There isn't dissociation necessarily between the parts, and that there has been some problems with applying IFS to DID. There are some people who are now adapting IFS to treat DID, And when it's applied to DID, the alters are seen as parts that are more separated and distinct than you would see in a person without DID. And they depathologize the parts. So this is especially important when you're looking at so-called persecutors. And the goal is to create harmony, not fusion. And it focuses on reconnecting with the self. And that's where things get a little tricky, because even when applying the theory to DID, they still view the person as having a core self. Now, I want to take some time to talk just a little bit about how we think of these different theories to describe how DID may form, or the aspects of personality and things like that. In our video about theory of structural dissociation, we talked a lot about how the theory does describe our experience, but we do have some issues with it. The biggest issue we probably have with the theory of structural dissociation is how they define parts between emotional parts and apparently normal parts. We don't align with that description. We feel like for our system, we are mostly consisting of what the theory would call mixed parts. And the theory allows for these mixed parts, which is somewhere between an apparently normal part and an emotional part, but it's kind of seen as the exception. And even by allowing the presence of mixed parts, it kind of discounts the dichotomy of emotional parts and apparently normal parts. When we look at core theory, that absolutely does not fit our experience. We don't feel like we ever got to develop a cohesive sense of self. Instead, we have some alters who have a very strong sense of who they are as an alter, and other alters that really don't feel like they have any kind of identity. It doesn't feel like we were one person that then broke into parts, more that we were never one person to begin with. It is important to note that some systems do connect with core theory. I am in a few DID groups where members will talk about the core or the original alter in their system. Now, the theory of structural dissociation might argue that these core parts are hosts that see themselves as original because they are so dissociated from their trauma and their other parts. I personally don't want to discount somebody's experience of themselves. Part of what makes DID so difficult is that you learn not to trust yourself. And I think that it's important that we believe people when they talk about how they experience their system. Our biggest gripe with core theory is that it automatically creates this assumption that the core personality is the most important. Because the parts exist to protect the core is seen as the true personality. In the theory, core and host are often conflated, so people will assume the host of a system is the one in charge. Every part of a system is important. Failing to address the needs of a part and instead trying to force them to conform to what the host wants can cause a lot of resentment and system instability. With our personal experience, non-host alters hate when people assume that I am the most important alter just because I am the host. Every alter is equally important. I can't just force what I want on the rest of the system. Because I am the host and spent so much time not knowing that the others existed, I do tend to make decisions without consulting the others. This can cause a lot of negative emotions and resistance. So I try to remember that we need to make decisions as a team. And I do get very frustrated when people don't understand that I'm not in charge. This is not a dictatorship. We've even had parts have to tell therapists that I'm not the only one that matters. And I really think this misunderstanding is because people generally look at DID through the lens of core theory, and the average person has never heard of structural dissociation. Now again, this is our system experience, and not everybody is going to feel the same way. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about our thoughts on internal family systems. Again, this is not going to be a deep dive, but just some general thoughts on the research that we did about IFS. We don't love it, especially when it's applied to DID. First of all, IFS relies on the idea of a core self, and as I've stated, that's just not aligned with our experience. Some practitioners may look at the self as a more spiritual concept and really referring to a higher self. This is something that I at least can entertain because it does align with my spirituality, but it's going to be problematic for other systems with different experiences, especially those who are atheist or have experienced religious trauma. The therapeutic model can also reinforce the idea that therapists should only talk to the host. There are a lot of therapists who refuse to talk to other alters during sessions, which would be extremely detrimental to us. The reason therapy works for us is because our therapist encourages all parts to come to the session. I also have an issue with the language. Because of the terms parts and system, IFS can be confused for DID. I do not think that the parts explained by IFS are the same as parts in DID. And I think by using the same language, it waters down the DID experience. The caveat to this is we actually borrowed parts language from IFS. IFS introduced parts and system in the 1980s. While that language started to be applied to DID as early as the 80s, it became popular in the early 2000s. So arguably, the confusion isn't the fault of IFS, but it is important to acknowledge that confusion exists. Some systems do find IFS to be helpful. And like I said previously, some clinicians are beginning to adapt IFS more carefully to DID, such as not enforcing this concept of a core self. And looking at how IFS depathologizes parts, I think that is why a lot of people lean towards it. They like that idea of the parts not being the illness, right? I'm conflicted when it comes to this idea. I do like that in IFS, the parts are not the pathology. DID is a creative, adaptive response to significant trauma. The alters are not the core issue. The issue is the trauma, and the alters are the solution. What causes the issues related to alters are, 1, the amnesia between alters, and 2, the possibly maladaptive beliefs and behaviors that the alters have adopted to protect the system. I like that in IFS, parts aren't bad, just misguided. That being said, I do consider DID a disorder, and it causes significant problems in my life. The existence of alters isn't the problem, but our lack of communication and maladaptive behaviors are. There's been a huge movement to depathologize in the mental health community, but for me personally, diagnosis is important. As you can see, I have a lot of thoughts on IFS, and I've only brushed the surface, so do let us know if you want us to explore it more deeply in another video. The last thing that I want to mention is a problem that I find with both the theory of structural dissociation and internal family systems. I feel like the terms used to describe parts is very limiting. And now I may be taking the language a little too literally. As I mentioned, our system seems to consist mostly of mixed parts as defined by the theory of structural dissociation. So the ANP-EP dichotomy doesn't really work for us. When it comes to IFS, the only label we really identify with is the managers. The language in IFS is not nuanced enough. For us, the idea of roles that is often discussed in DID communities works better. This includes categories like hosts, protectors, gatekeepers, persecutors, etc. I think this language encapsulates the variety of parts that exist. Although I will say, again, I did identify with the role of managers in IFS, and I may start using that to describe a set of alters that we have in our system. I cannot stress enough that these are our opinions based on our experiences. Every system is going to have their own self-concept and may or may not agree with certain theories or pieces of theories. We just wanted to look at the differences and share our thoughts on them. Is there a particular theory that you resonate with? Or do you think that there's different pieces of theories that really seem to fit your experience? Let us know in the comments. And again, let us know if you'd like us to explore internal family systems a little deeper. And we hope to see you soon. Until next time, take care and stay well. Bye.